Okay, I'm here with Dr. Stefan Cibian. Please introduce yourself to our readers.
Hello, my name is Stefan Cibian. I'm a researcher with the Făgăraș Research Institute and also Academy Associate with Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs.
And where are you from, Stefan?
I originally come from Romania.
Okay. We're here at the conference in Pécs, right? And we have many Eastern European scholars on Africa presenting. What drives the interest in Africa, in the region? What is your take there?
Well, in the last couple of years, I think the interest in Africa of the Central and Eastern European countries has grown significantly. The new EU member states most of them have opened new embassies in the region. Now, obviously, this is not a new relationship. Most of these countries have had quite strong relations with African countries during their communist period. It's basically a emerging relation between Central Eastern Europe and Africa that what we are seeing at the moment. Where this comes from, I would say that there are a few factors that contribute to this renewed interest. On the Central East European side, one factor is definitely the financial crisis of late 2000s, which I think has shown to the leaders of the Central and Eastern European countries that their economies are heavily dependent on EU, intra-EU trade, and this obviously has posed economic challenges to the region during the economic crisis. Another important factor, I think, is the migration crisis, a more recent migration crisis, which has come to be politically extremely important for some of the new EU member states. What this has done, I think, in relation to Africa, is to raise the relevance and the priority of Africa on the foreign policy agenda of the new EU member states. Now, obviously, there is an underpinning important relation between Central Eastern Europe and Africa. That is, these countries, the new EU member states, being part of the EU and being part, therefore, of the EU relations with Africa and with the Africa, Caribbean and Pacific states. In the last more than a decade, these countries have been socialized basically in the EU relations with Africa, and I think these countries are now becoming more literate in engaging with Africa, I think, from the European perspective as well. Yes, I will stop here.
Okay, thank you. What are the key debates then in your countries beyond maybe? I mean, the politicians, right? They have particular issues they always push for in discourses, but more generally in the population, media, among business people in your country and or civil society organizations, etc. What are the key debates when it comes to this renewed interest in having particular relationships with African countries?
Well, I would say that generally this is an exotic topic. There is not much discussion about Africa besides that there is something starting to happen, sometimes not even that. So I don't think that Africa is very present in the public debate. The publics, both in Central Eastern Europe and in Sub-Saharan Africa, are quite, I should say, little informed about the situation and development in the other region. So we cannot see actually much public debate going on this topic. What I would say, however, is that there are some interesting policy debates to be had on this topic, and there are some contradictions that are evident and important in how these regions reconnect. One being that the Central East European countries obviously were communist until not long ago, and they had relations with the African countries from a communist standpoint. While now they are capitalist economies, part of the EU, and trying to reconnect to the African countries. And obviously, from a foreign policy perspective, this poses quite, I think, an interesting dilemma or challenge. So I think that's one important debate to be had. And then the second important debate to be had is related to the post-Cotonou negotiations in the framework of the EU, ACP, African, Caribbean, Pacific relations. And this aspect is the following. Most of the Central East European countries, while they are very interested in re-engaging with Africa primarily for economic purposes, in the post-Cotonou negotiations, they are very likely to put forward their interest in the Eastern neighborhood, and also their keen interest in migration, which is obviously something that is not liked by the African countries. So it will be interesting to see how the new EU member states are going to balance their interest in migration with their economic interest in Africa, because it's basically competing agendas. The negotiations are still to be had, so we'll see how this will play out.
Thank you. You mentioned briefly the socialist era, and and what is then the legacy of, or in what way has this socialist era maybe repercussions for how the region engages with Africa at the moment, right?
The communist experience is obviously an important one. It's basically a lot of what these countries have in terms of their history with Africa. And it's not a small history. I mean, some of these countries have invested a lot, have built a lot of infrastructure, have given a lot of technical assistance to several African countries. This history is at the moment being revisited by these countries. It has been forgotten for a while. But it is being revisited, and I think the first area where we're seeing lessons learned from the communist period is primarily education and giving scholarships for African countries. And we can look at Hungary, for example, that is giving up to 900 scholarships per year for African countries, which is a substantive number of scholarships, close to what the UK is offering, for example. So there are lessons to be learned from the previous experience. That experience as well, it's a commonality, I think. It was also focused on economic interest, much more than ideology, actually. So this is another common thread. It will be interesting to see how this plays out, because Africa of today is obviously not the Africa of the Cold War. There is much more competition, many more important players in the African context. And the size of the new EU member states is not helpful for being very present in the African context. The third aspect, I think, is that moving is basically the transition aspect. These countries have moved from centralized economies and totalitarian regimes to more democratic regimes, although with some let's say, challenges at the moment, but definitely to capitalist economies. And this has entailed a transformation of state institutions, transformation of constitutions, and the transformation of economies, all very recent experiences, which are obviously very useful also for many African countries, or could be potentially useful for many African countries.
Okay, final question then. What's the relationship between the Eastern European region and particular countries there with in terms of African studies, right? In other parts of Europe, especially Western Europe, obviously, lots of journals get published and edited there. And what is maybe a particular Eastern European contribution to African studies in a global sense?
So I think this relationship between scholars in Central Eastern Europe and Western Europe is at the beginning. I think we see more events that bring together scholars from both regions, quite a lot probably Central Eastern European scholars studying and doing research in Western institutions. And what we do see in the region is a number of Africa study centers, Africa research centers being established. So there is a research infrastructure focused on Africa that is now emerging. So most likely there will be much more going on in a couple of years. The contribution that scholars from Central Eastern Europe can make, I think, to African studies is one that relates to the communist experience and transition experience of these countries. And basically, I do think people that have experienced this communist period and transition period, scholars from this region, will most likely have a different take on several of the important questions dealing with Africa. So this is obviously a literature that is emerging, It's at the beginning, but it will be interesting to follow and see where it goes. I would also mention that I think a lot of the debates in Africa are of importance and relevance for Central Eastern Europe. Unfortunately, in the context of Central Eastern Europe, we haven't had a very reflexive transition. It was more of a neoliberal agenda embraced and applied. So I think in terms of dealing with the transformations that these countries have been through, the post-colonial literature, for example, in Africa, and more critical takes on the capitalist transformation are all very relevant, and that will also be very interesting to follow.
Thank you very much, Stefan.
Thank you.